Welcome back to the Four Gardens podcast. I'm Jake Ifshin. The Four Gardens is an approach to cultivate a life of balance, joy, and abundance by focusing on four key areas. On this show, I talk to people inspiring me in the four gardens of health, nature, creativity, and service. To learn more, go to fourgardenspodcast.com and follow at Four Gardens Podcast on Instagram. Make sure to like and subscribe to hear new episodes and support this project. If you're enjoying listening to the podcast, take a minute to check out our YouTube channel, which features short video clips from the podcast as well as engaging original content, such as the first Four Gardens vlog. My guest today is Dan Turello. Dan is a writer, editor, cultural historian, and photographer, and the creator of Alternative DC Portraits Project, which he describes as a playground experiment, an invitation to be curious and create meaning together. The Alternative DC Portraits Project features folks who live or have lived in DC and who don't fit the mold of what the world thinks of as being typical of the city. I was honored to be featured recently as one of Dan's Alternative DC portraits. Check out the link to that project in the description box. I'm looking forward to learning more about Dan. Let's jump right in. Dan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Hey, Jake. Thanks for having me on. Great to see you this morning.
Yeah, I've been excited for this one. I just had so much fun collaborating with you last month on the Alternative Portraits DC project. And yeah, that was just a great time we had together.
That was a blast. I feel like we really got to be creative and to make something together. So thank you for doing that and for being a part of it.
Yeah, it was fun. You had me back in a really pretty little garden, and we were getting creative back there, finding the right light, getting some different ideas with the mandolin. So even though you'll only see one photo on the website, there's a whole series of photos Dan took to get to that.
Yeah, and that whole journey. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think my favorite ones from that shoot are still the ones where you're smelling the roses. It's they're just so natural and unencumbered. You're just out in the middle of the flowers, and it's just it was this very I don't know, very particular moment.
Yeah, I was really feeling it, and yeah, just that combination of getting to do the photos with you and then collaborate on the written piece as well. It was just a really great process for me in my experience of. I know you say in the description of capturing a moment or capturing a time in my life, so definitely felt honored to be in there and to work with you on it.
Yeah, likewise.
I want to ask more about it because I think maybe I'm the 10th in the series or even more you've done before. And just overall hearing about, with our audience, sharing more about Alternative DC Portraits and what led you, I mean, a little bit about what this is and what kind of got you into doing this project.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Great question. I love sharing about that. So it's really an idea that came to me. I've always enjoyed photography. I was taking pictures back in college. I think the first SLR I ever got my hands on was right before a trip I took to India, and India was just this amazing country to jump into photography. The landscapes, the people, the diversity, the colors. It was beautiful. So I got really into it at that point. But then I sort of set it aside and I just pursued a lot of other areas that were of interest to me: the writing, the scholarship, the history, the literature. And so photography got set aside for a while. But then during the pandemic, somehow it was just a way to stay connected to people. And the idea for this particular project came to me actually while I was during a Five Rhythms Friday evening session. Five Rhythms is a movement meditation. And I know you featured, you talked to Ann Kite in one of your earlier episodes. That's a fantastic conversation. I encourage everyone to listen to that. But I was doing this Five Rhythms wave and just reflecting. I mean, the pandemic's been a hard time for everybody. But also I work in politics at the intersection of scholarship and politics. And the last few years have been challenging in that space. There hasn't always been a lot of hope There's been a lot of conflict. There's been a lot of cynicism. And so the Five Rhythms community, the yoga community more broadly, is a community that I look to for inspiration and for hope. And so in the middle of this wave, somehow the idea came to me, there's just all of these beautiful people, beautiful souls with compelling stories. And I wanted to tell those stories and to give folks a chance to tell their own stories. The other side of that was just when people think of DC, there's a lot of stereotypes. You think of folks in suits, you think of politicians, you think of lobbyists, maybe you think of consultants. But in fact, the DC that I know and love, it has all of those realms. But then there's also this other side, and it's folks who are creative, who are writing poetry and making music and putting on shows and just all sorts of different realms. And I really wanted to tell that side of the DC story. So that was the inspiration.
That really hit, a couple parts of that really hit home for me. And I want to reflect back that last thing you were saying about telling this alternative story of DC and the people here, because my roots go back in DC. Part of my family, 4 generations, and I'm born and raised in DC, and seeing the different sides of the city that, yeah, there have always been these different sides for me of the side you mentioned, the suit wearing, the political side, the lobbyists, the industry of the government, and all of that. And then, I've also danced a lot with you in these other alternative communities too. There's all these other pockets of types of folks. It's a big major city, of course, but there is this beautiful realm of a community we built being in DC, and to feature that. It's one of my inspirations around the podcast too, is to get the story out of other people, of these different perspectives. I don't localize it around DC, but I think it is a really neat intention to get the word out and to share alternative messages that maybe wouldn't be heard or witnessed in the photography case otherwise. So I just resonate with a few of these different parts of your mission.
I really felt that from your podcast, and I got to say, I've been having a blast listening to all of the episodes. I'm so glad to be a part of this conversation. I mean, I think back to a few of them, hearing Melly talk about creativity and perfectionism. I know perfectionism has been a big challenge, opportunity and challenge in my life. So that was a great episode. They've all been great. And Kites has been great, was great. There were just a lot of different super conversations. So I've actually been imagining how fun it would be to plant an idea in your head. Maybe you've thought about it already, but having a 2-day festival with all of the podcast folks, and what an amazing opportunity that would be.
It's
So
a dream
I hope you do it at some point.
It's a dream of mine. Yeah, I would love your collaboration with that, or just the idea is beautiful. So yeah, to get everyone together, to build community in person, or even online. These are projects that I'm currently working on. Because I know that 4 Gardens are about self-cultivation, and a big continual realization from the podcast and the events that I'm doing is we need each other. We need community to really grow, to really thrive. I need that, and that it's just essential. And it's one of the things you mentioned about the pandemic, challenges of the pandemic, is staying in community when some of our normal spaces and workplaces have been so disrupted by that challenge, including dance. And yeah, I just think that's really an important thing. And thanks for sharing that vision too.
Yeah, sure.
Before we move on from alternative portraits DC, I'd love to hear just a few highlights from it, or other little wisdoms or lessons you've had doing this on this journey.
Yeah, thanks for asking. The first thing that comes to mind is that every portrait session has just been so much fun. They've all been so unique, and they all follow their own journey. And the one that stands out in my mind right now, probably just because it's the most recent one I did. You mentioned the one with you, and actually on that same day I had done a shoot with our mutual friend Umair. And I asked Umair whether I could share a little bit about that session, and he was happy to have me do that. So, one of the things that really comes out from the sessions is that I do a lot of planning for them. So there's a lot of There's a lot of interaction, and we're talking. The first thing I ask folks is what makes you, similar to what you asked, Jake. What makes you feel alive these days? What's lighting you up? What are your passions? What do you want to express to the world? And then hearing that, we build a color scheme, and we build a setting, and so all of that is very planned out. But then there's this beauty of just showing up and finding that every session follows its own course, and you can't predict that. So in the case of with Umair, we had talked about he's a creator of this a healing space called Low Hanging Fruit, and I encourage you to go read his writing on this. But we had talked about doing a shoot in that actual space. So on the back porch, there's some beautiful, there's rugs, there's tapestry, there's cool colors, there's great light coming in. So that was the initial intention, and we had planned it for a Sunday morning. And so I showed up at his place about probably 10 or 10:30. And I think what was immediately evident was I don't think Umair is a morning person, and I know I'm not a morning person. So for the first 10 or 15 minutes, we were just we had some tea, and we were catching up, and we were just chatting, and it was really nice. And then we took a few photos on the porch. But then there was this whole other dynamic. Like Umair, actually, he at one point I was changing a lens, and I see him poke his face around the doorway, and he's kind of got this impish grin on his face. And then he showed up, and he had this full-fledged, like full size, I don't even know what to call it. I think it was a puppet that he had made, that he had sculpted in at a retreat in Mexico. And all of a sudden it became a photo shoot with two people, because this puppet, like the emotions in the eyes were really intense. And seeing the interaction with Umair, I mean, it was super fascinating. So we went down that whole route. And then we went back to the porch, and the colors were sort of orange, and it was working. But Umair was really, he was working through some emotions. It was super interesting. So there were some stomping on the ground pictures and some angry pictures. And we went through sort of this whole journey that morning. And then towards the end of that, I was really being pulled to this part of the house that had beautiful natural light. There was this blue upholstered chair. By that time, Umair was in this fluffy white bathrobe. It was just so him. And we were just sitting there. The light was coming in from the window. Umair was playing with this amazing head of black hair that he has. And that's the photo that ended up being the portrait. I mean, it was just like, wow, that's Umair. It's super relaxed. He's just in his element, and I love that portrait of him. And reflecting back, had we just set out to do that right at the start, it probably wouldn't have happened, just because we really needed to go through that whole journey of getting there.
I'm excited to have Umair on the podcast in the near future. I think I'll probably do it in that space live you described when I'm in DC with him. And yeah, he's such an amazing character, and he has great hair. I saw that photo. The hair is really the star of that photo. And yeah, check that out on the same link for Alternative Portraits, Umair's story. And yeah, it's been really wonderful co-creating with him. I was part of the Low Hanging Fruit group for a while there and creating those events. And so there's a lot that Umair and I are going to share. And I just also, reflecting, one part about your story is that I like the way you are just learning about a person in a different way than I am in the podcast. Like you're creating together, but you're kind of researching this person in a really artful way, in a way that's like, you really get some of Umair's essence in that photo of the big bathrobe and the giant hair, and like you really got a piece of him there. And I just share that in my own way, wanting to do that in the podcast too, of really finding out I'm so grateful for each of these episodes, because like, I think I'm learning the most maybe out of anyone, because I'm getting to spend these time with people that are fascinating to me and go deeper, and people that I would know through dance, for instance. That's how we know each other, but we might chat for 5 or 10 minutes at an event or dance, but I would never spend an hour in these contexts going into, your artistic passions or your creative or professional, or some of your core beliefs and ideas. And actually that's part of the alternative portraits project too, or those questions are pretty deep. Like I did a few rewrites on mine, on the written piece, too, of the questions you ask really are fairly deep questions, life questions about passion, about my story. So yeah, I just like, I'm learning from your approach, being part of this and doing it and integrating that in this project too.
Yeah, and I can say the same for you and your podcast. You know, it's interesting. What you were saying just made me realize there's a whole approach. Well, one of the ironies is, you know, when I was a kid, I really didn't like having my picture taken. It felt like someone was taking something away from me or capturing something that I didn't want to necessarily give. And there's a whole approach to photography, and it's more on the photojournalism side where you're capturing the image and you're documenting something. And I understand, you know, there's a tremendous amount of value to that. It's a different way of doing it. My approach is very different from that, but because it really is an emergent. It's a co-creation. It's not trying to take, you know, to capture a scene, but it's really building something together.
That's so spot on with how you work of building something together, because there's conversation before, during, and after, really open conversations and exchange of ideas that I really, and I do that with the podcast too, of asking people up front, having a conversation before, and then during and after. How do we get this message out to afterwards? Will be the conversation after this too. So it's not just you know, to make that product of the photo or of the audio recording or of the video that I'm making. It's not just, yeah, it's helped me understand that it's a lot about what happens before and afterwards too, to get to this, the fruit that we want to harvest, that low hanging fruit, to peel that
beautiful image,
to bring that down. So Dan, just reflecting too on how I know you, and in a way I see you as embodying some of this alternative portraits DC intention of the two sides of DC, the two worlds that you walk in. So I met you in the world of conscious dance, but you also have this background too in academics. And so I'm kind of curious first how you got into Five Rhythms, how that practice, because knowing your background is kind of surprising. Here's this guy who's a serious academic, and every week I'm dancing with him wild Five Rhythms dances. So talk a little bit about that journey.
I love it. You're making me smile because it's just I'm feeling like more embodied already, and it feels fantastic. So the story, you know, had you asked me 10 or 15 years ago, had you told me 10 or 15 years ago, you know, Dan, you're going to be spending your Friday evenings with a group of people, and you're going to be dancing and moving, and there's not going to be any booze or smoke or any sort of mind altering substance, and you're going to be barefoot and you're just going to be like creatively expressing yourself, I would have just laughed. I mean, I would have told you, yeah, you're batshit crazy, man. No way. The first time I heard about conscious dance was actually in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was in the middle of doing a PhD at Harvard, and I had a friend who was into these yoga communities, and I remember him telling me about this contact improv. Actually, is what he was doing, and I just heard it, and I was like, "That sounds like the weirdest thing I've ever heard." And I was like, you know, have fun, tell me about it. God bless you. Sounded great for him, but not for me. And then I got into yoga. That's a whole other story, and we can maybe come back to that. But back in DC, I made my way to an ecstatic dance one evening, and there too, like I was actually there, and it was in case you know, as you mentioned, my natural habitat is in my mind. So I spent most of my life reading and writing and working at the intersection of academia and politics. So being at this ecstatic dance for the first time, I was watching these people just moving and expressing themselves. and I had absolutely no idea what to do. It was just, it was strange, but something about it was pulling me in and wanting, and somehow wanting to do more. So the next step was I ended up at, it was a 2 hour, five rhythms wave that Ann Kite did on a Sunday morning at the Edgewood Arts Building. And I went to this, and all of a sudden I was hooked. And I was actually moving in an awkward kind of way. But at the end of that 2 hours, Ann announced a retreat, a weekend retreat that she was going to be doing at her home outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. And I just followed my gut, and on a whim, I signed up for this thing. So a couple weekends later, I spent the next 36 hours, pretty much the majority of that dancing with a group of about 15 people. And it was just one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And it was really my way in, and I've been hooked ever since. And it's become a big part of my, just a big part of my community in DC. And so I've been super grateful to Ann and to all of the folks who are in that world. It's really been life changing.
I'm so grateful to them too. And Ann is my first five rhythms teacher, along with Richard. I've danced with her more than anybody, I think. And I think you said this line before of you used to living in your mind and tracking how five rhythms practice, this invitation to be in your body. How has that, what kind of ripples has that made in your life or in your perspective?
It's a great question. I think it's just, and it's been part of a larger journey that's involved yoga and that's involved meditation. But just the idea that there is more to life than just thinking, and the value of an embodied practice in terms of learning about emotions, learning about how emotions express themselves. I think I'd always thought of emotions as something that were to be controlled. So emotions were somewhat dangerous, following maybe a more Greek philosophical idea. The tracks through the Stoics, and just generally in history, there's been a distrust of how emotions are expressed and what they can do for you. A lot of times we're seen as leading you astray from a more rational, objective point of view. And I mean, I'm a big proponent of logic and rationality, and I think those are in learning and discovery. Those are wonderful worlds and ones that I inhabit and that I enjoy and that I love and I see the value of. And there's this whole other dimension that I was missing, and learning to not to judge emotions, not to think of them as good or bad, but to simply be with them. That's been paradigm changing for me, because all of a sudden I'm able to breathe into my body and actually have a sense of what it is that I'm feeling, and be able to appreciate that. That sounds very abstract, but I'm looking for the words to describe this.
It makes total sense to me, Dan. And that I have a similar story with this. And I know from my experience that trying to think my way out of emotions or think my way out of embodied challenges, not using my body to not listening to my body, at least, was part of my journey too. And I think I was raised in a similar way of thinking that the mind defines me, that the mind is very Western. I think, therefore I am, kind of the pinnacle of that, of separating mind and body, and finding that causes a lot of problems for me, and it causes a lot of problems in the world. It creates, for each of us, I think, but it creates unique challenges for each of us that live in our minds. And so I think this five rhythms practice for me helped me get kind of unstuck in some ways too in my life, to kind of shake out ecstatic and contact. I had a lot of ripples in my life too. So I think that's interesting that you found your way into your body through dance and through yoga and through meditation. And just I'm reflecting that back and realizing that it also, to me, opened up the community too. Both of us, we already named that we have a community now that comes from these spaces. So I also see you as now not just the individual transformation, but you're part of a collective kind of transformation that different people are playing parts in. Anne and Melly and Umair, everyone you mentioned, as part of a wider community that's bringing the attention back to the body too. We've mentioned a few times in this interview, you've mentioned your academic background and your studies. For people who don't know this side of your life, I'd love to hear more about your background in this, in your field, and what you're working on.
Yeah, sure. This is always fun to talk about. So, I've always been a reader. I've always loved reading, and I studied literature in college, and then went on some world travels. Ended up in India and in Switzerland, and then eventually came back to DC and started a PhD program in political theory. So, looking at really the history of ideas and the history of political thought and how we organize our communities and how, what makes those work. And then, from there, I didn't finish that PhD. I started working in politics in DC in international development. And that was because I wanted to learn how politics actually worked. But to make a long story short, I did that for a while. And then what happened was I'm a dual citizen. So I grew up in Italy. My mom is American. My dad was Italian. But from DC, the unexpected happened. I don't think you know this story, Jake, but I got drafted by the Italian military. That's a long, crazy story, but I ended up going. And so I spent 10 months in the Alps with the Italian Alpine troops, and I was running around the mountains with grappa and wearing brown Bavarian flannel, just below the knee shorts, and running around with some pretty fun semi-automatic weapons. So that was a whole adventure, but that got me really intrigued by World War II history and looking at what happened in Italy during the resistance. And so after that, pretty soon after that, I ended up at Harvard, and the intention was to study, really fascinated by resistance movements and what inspired individuals to fight fascism during the war. So looking at their journals, looking at their writings, looking at their general belief structure, and where they found the courage to do these things. That was the intention. I got to Harvard. I went down all sorts of different of other trails. I got really interested in medieval poetry and Renaissance literature and art, but more generally, the overall framework was being intrigued by how technological change really impacted communities. So starting all the way back with the medieval mystics and looking at how early innovations in business and commerce and early trade routes, how all of that was changing social dynamics within medieval cities and within communities. And then taking that through the Renaissance and on, all the way to contemporary times, looking at how technology changes our lifestyle. I didn't mention all of this, by the way, was inspired by, I don't know if you're a sci-fi fan, but
I am.
Battlestar Galactica, the new version, the one that was done, just in the last decade or so. It really sets up a conflict between, a tension between humanity, human expression, and the AI and technology, and how that plays out. So that got me intrigued about, why it is that we're scared of technology and scared of how technology impacts our lives, which got me going back all the way to the medievals and looking how it evolved over time. So that's the snapshot. A lot of different threads there, but super fun.
Going forward a little to the finding yourself in medieval, like getting swept up in medieval poetry and medieval Renaissance thinking. What was it about that time period that captivated you?
I got really intrigued by some of the religious orders during the medieval period. So the Franciscans are the ones that I spent the most time on. St. Francis. Everybody loves St. Francis. Actually, one of the reasons I started writing about St. Francis was because I was during a summer I was out in California and in Santa Barbara actually, and I was visiting a friend and hanging out with a bunch of surfers, and we went to this bar, and there was this sort of this local band that was playing cover tunes and some punk tunes and whatnot, and just kind of very very iconoclastic and anti-system, talking about the military-industrial complex and fun evening out. But after the show, we were talking, and the guy asked me, what do you do? And I was like, well, I study medieval literature, and I'm reading about St. Francis. And he was like, oh, dude, St. Francis is where it's at, man. I mean, it's like there was this immediate connection, and I think people still hear St. Francis and they think of a guy who wanted to be more authentic and wanted to connect to nature and was friends with the wolves and with the was very revolutionary in his own way, and started a community that started with a band of just a few men, and then over just one generation developed into the largest religious order in Europe. So looking at how that developed and how it grew, and then some of the tensions that it was running into was something that intrigued me.
I'm really interested in that. I don't know that story very well. Is there a book you'd recommend on St. Francis?
I would start with with St. Francis himself. Look at some of his writings, his poetry, and also maybe we can put this in the show notes, but just
Sure.
Some of the biographies of St. Francis that detail what he was up to and his vision.
Sounds great.
Some fun stories there.
Yeah, we'll put it in. And you mentioned too that you went back to the medieval. The question, which is on my mind too, I think is one of the big questions of our time, of how do we relate to technology, the fears around technology, and the challenges it creates for democracy and for other parts of our lives. Many parts of our lives is changing everything. You said you looked at some of this question and then also went back to the medieval times to look at the evolution of it. We share something about that study.
Yeah. So what really struck me with St. Francis and the Franciscans is that they set out to be this movement that was completely off the grid. They wanted to do their own thing. They wanted to live in poverty. They wanted to be in community with nature and with their fellow human beings. And they did this, and it was a big conflict with the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was rich at the time at that point, and so any prophetic voice that was preaching poverty was disruptive to the system. What was really intriguing to me, though, was that within just one generation of St. Francis, everybody loved the movement. So everybody it grew. So you had thousands of people that were now a part of it. And these folks had to live in communities, and they had to have infrastructure. And people were making donations. They were leaving their, they were writing wills and leaving their inheritances to the Franciscans. So the Franciscans was a movement that was birthed in poverty, but within a generation became one of the richest movements in Europe. And so now you had all these conflicts within the movement about, what do we do with all of this wealth? And what struck me was and I think it's a tension that we see over and over in history, and we see it now in a lot of our alternative communities. You have a community that sets out to be revolutionary or just even to reform things, and the question is, when it grows, how do you integrate that into society at large? And my takeaway from all of that is really, in a sense, the ability to commune with nature, the ability to commune with fellow human beings, is a form of luxury, in the sense that it depends on an infrastructure. You have to have order and stability. You have to have a working legal system. You have to have overall political structures that ensure peace. I mean, you can have communities like this in in societies that are in upheaval, but it certainly isn't ideal. You look at Syria or Somalia or any country where there's a civil war going on, and certainly you have resistance movements, but it's not a situation that you want to be in. So the Franciscans, like almost all resistance movements since then, have had to deal with the challenge of needing to figure out how they were going to be a part of society at large, and how they were going to interact with political structures, how they were going to make that interface. And in that sense, I think it's a lesson that's relevant to us today, because creative communities. I mean, I think the danger is for creative communities to become isolated and not realize that, in fact, the political structure is one that they depend on, because the rule of law and predictability and safety and general security are all things that we need and we want. So if there's anything that comes through to me from that story, is to just be conscious of the fact that we need to remain engaged, and the texture and the fabric of society is both complex and fragile and needs to be safeguarded.
It's a really good reminder for me and other people, like-minded people to me too, I think, that are looking to reconnect and support nature reconnection, support alternative communities and ways of relating and healing communities, all these things that there's a lot that they depend on in terms of the infrastructure, as you said, around the society being stable. Even getting in the woods in Syria, I'm guessing, or in a lot of countries with great upheaval, and I think countries in Central America or in Africa, like the woods are not safe. To go in the woods, that is the home of the rebels, the home of insurgency, is in the hills, in the woods. Just to be able to safely move about, even marginalized communities in the U.S. don't feel welcome or safe in national parks or in. There's a lot of work to be done, just making natural spaces more welcoming. So there's all this privilege that goes into getting to go out and try and be the Buddha, or to be Saint Francis, or to embrace that kind of spiritual quest. I think it's woven throughout many different societies. When you look at who gets to get the level of education of the Brahmin, of the aristocrat, these are the people who have left a lot of the literature to us. The great texts have been in privileged caste systems or classes. So I think that disconnecting from that reality and that truth is dangerous. I appreciate all the reminders about this, and there is emerging, I think, scholarly work too, to look at what is the what's happening at these transformational festivals in terms of privilege and culture, and the intersection of different technologies, a cultural appropriation that's going on that really demands our awareness, demands our at least recognition. If we're going to enjoy these privileges, enjoy this space, let's recognize. And I think it reminds me of the higher purpose of that, which is to still participate in democracy, still participate in social institutions, not just say they're all evil and dismiss them, that at some level they require our tending or our cultivation too, not just always pure escape, pure rejection. Is kind of almost an unrealistic way of being. So yeah, there's just a lot there. I think that's an important message for a lot of communities that I'm part of.
I love you've said that in such a beautiful way. I love that, that creative tension of being in a community that's creating new paradigms and thinking of new ways of being, but at the same time is aware and is grateful of the general, the overall infrastructure, and how to be a part of that, and how to contribute to that, and how to have conversations that are engaging with folks with different points of view. So thank you for articulating that. It reminds me, there's a beautiful passage in one of the early Franciscan texts, Francis talking about how he was wandering early on in his life. He was wandering out in the middle of the forest, and just basically being an ascetic, so not really wearing much in way of clothing. Saint Francis was the heir to a wealthy merchant family in Assisi. It was the newly emerging middle class, and so his family was wealthy. But when he decided to make this break, he stripped down and he left all of that aside. So then he was wandering around the forest and he was kind of doing his ascetic thing. But there's a moment where he has to come back and he has to find, he finds someone who gives him a robe and someone who gives him a bowl of soup and shelter. And really, the bottom line is, if you're being chased by wolves, you don't have the space to meditate. You don't have the space to do to really pursue ascetic practices or any kind of practice that will get you closer to the transcendent, to the to an experience of community. You have to have a minimal amount of sustenance and energy and community in order to do that. So I think that really captures that balance that you've articulated really well, Jake.
Yeah, you can't do that when you're being chased by wolves. And yeah, it's just good to recognize all the infrastructure and history that we're building on top of, I think, when it comes to new paradigms. And feeling inspired too to ask you, just bring us up to the present day to what you're working on right now, what your field of study is in the moment.
Right now, I've been writing. I've been working on a bunch of writing projects, but the one that's keeping me busy and that has been for a while is just looking at. I've been really concerned about climate change. Climate change is something that keeps me awake at night every now and then, and just the amount of change on the horizon, the way it's going to impact our communities and our lifestyles. And I think there's a couple different ways that we react to it, and they're both super dangerous. So one is just the complete denial. We go on living our lives as we always have, and that of course is going to be dangerous down the line. And the other direction is to really go down the path of despair, and that in a way that leads to the same kind of outcome, because if you're despairing, you're giving up and you're not actually making any changes or evaluating things and plotting a more deliberate course. So just thinking about a way, I always say I don't have trouble thinking if we project out 1,000 years from now, like I think humanity is going to do fine 1,000 years from now. Like technology is going to be at a point where it's able, we've made a full transition to alternative energy sources, and population growth will have stabilized perhaps. So projecting that far out is almost easier. It's the next 100 to 200 years that are going to be really messy and really complicated, because the disruptions are going to be incredible. And so charting a way through that, thinking about what our political structures look like, thinking about how we make transitions to sustainable sources of energy, and also thinking about how it is that we consume. That's a whole other theme, but looking at, I think, a consumption in a positive way. I mean, it's, ever since the Renaissance, we've been consuming more, and that consumption is also what allows us, it comes back to the conversation about luxury, that the luxury, the excess of production is what allows us to have pause and to be creative, to have the space and the time to do art and to do music and to do all of the things that we value as creatives and as human beings. And just thinking through, but at the same time, that same path of consumption has been very challenging for the environment. So thinking through how it is that we relate to the world around us, to nature, to the environment, how we consume, and how to plot a path forward is what's really been keeping me occupied.
When it comes to climate change, I think about it, and part of the challenge of me relating to it is that there's this personal sphere of influence we have on it, of our habits, our diet, our travel, our consumption, you mentioned how we consume. And then there's also this larger scale of it, which we've referred to as well, of the political structure, the corporations, the lobbyists, the large entities that are playing such an important role in whether this gets how this gets related to how climate change is approached is so much. There's so much that's out of our control with this issue too. So interested to hear your approach to engaging with both the macro level and the micro level of climate change.
It makes me think about I've got a friend who lives in Kansas and is works as a mediator and works with farming communities, both at the micro level, but also with the very big corporations and the big farming enterprises. And we talk about this all the time and trade, texts and articles. What strikes me is that, you mentioned the personal sphere and the more public corporate political sphere. There's so much we can do on a personal level, like, move towards a more plant-based diet and move towards more sustainable types of agriculture. And a lot of the areas that you've been involved with, which is fantastic. That said, I think there's a level. The really big policy decisions are made at a more central level, and those are what's really going to steer the direction of our society over the next decades. And without that more central policy engagement, I think it's really I don't want to say it's a losing effort, but there are things that need to happen at a high level to redirect society at large. And I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a matter of being involved personally with personal choices, but also remembering to remain involved politically and staying engaged, but also realizing that there's just a lot of nuance. And when I think of the big big agricultural movements, part of the equation is that there are a lot of people in the world. And when you look back and look at at India in the 1960s and 1970s, before the Green Revolution, a lot of that was driven by the Rockefeller Foundation, and bringing high industrial agriculture to India. And all of a sudden you go through this technological revolution, and people are being fed. You no longer have famines, and malnutrition goes down. So while I'm wary of big industrial agriculture, I also recognize that there are a lot of people in the world who depend on it. And so being aware of how population plays into this is another big part of the equation.
Yeah, I see big agriculture as hopefully, I see it as being a passing phase in human evolution right now. And the great gratitude we can have for big agriculture is that statistically, you and I might not exist without big agriculture, because there'd be less people on the planet. We couldn't, that our lives might be dependent on there being more food. The changes that were made with fertilizer and other agricultural technologies 100 years ago have allowed human populations to really rise up. And yet big agriculture is incredibly destructive and responsible for many of the health problems that we now face and societal challenges. So my intention is that we grow out of that. We grow out of big agriculture into a new model. And I think at the same time that a lot of these, when I just want to talk about the personal sphere for a second, is I think that a lot of these changes that I also want to support people making around composting, around consuming less, like more minimalist lifestyles, more collaboration and growing food, connection to our food and our health. All these things also are part of I see this as going hand in hand with the reconnection to body, the spiritual transformations we talked about earlier in the conversation. St. Francis is maybe using their privilege instead of having 10 houses or 6 cars. St. Francis could have had that, right? But St. Francis made a different choice. And yes, that was dependent on his privilege. And we need privileged people who have the space to make a different choice and break out of the path of consumption and wealth for the sake of wealth, and use that privilege to start to create other models, start to make that spiritual choice to use less. Not because, look, yes, we're dependent on these big organizations doing it differently. Like if they don't change, if the incentives don't change in our economy for how we use fuels, for how we legislation we create, yeah, this might all be there might be a waste. But at the same time, I think the sake of doing it is for the spiritual. Like on a personal level, it is a spiritual choice as much as it is a practical choice.
Yeah, I think that's really beautifully stated, Jake. And you mentioned the idea that if it weren't for larger populations, there's a very good chance that the two of us and many of our friends would not be alive. And that really gets to the heart of the philosophical question, which is, life is sacred, life is precious, life is this amazing, incredible opportunity. And so, of course, we want more life and we want more creativity. And there's a limit, there's a cap to how many humans, how many individuals that the biosphere can actually sustain. And what that cap is a matter of debate, but I think there is, we recognize that there is a cap. So balancing that tension is where the real challenge comes in.
That's part of the great question of our times too. Intention is, how do we balance that? How do we are nature, so how do we live in harmony with nature? And that there's a question of how many of us that the planet can support at one time, I think is a big question. And approaching that with compassion and realism too, that big agriculture is not going to go away tomorrow because we have a lot of mouths to feed. There's many people that are hungry. It's not that we don't have enough food, but it's how the food's distributed too, which I think is another part of the spiritual challenge of how we share, is how we share the wealth, how we share the food is the other part of this equation too. It's confronting us now.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, Dan, I really got my wheels turning today in this conversation. I'm really grateful for you.
What an amazing conversation.
And wanted to see if there's anything else you want to mention before we close out, or any question you want to be asked that I didn't ask today.
I'm feeling really complete. Thanks so much for having me on the show. And I look forward to further explorations and conversations. And I just really so grateful for what you're doing with the podcast, all of the folks that you've had on the show. I'm learning a lot from all of them. So look forward to hearing more.
Thank you for listening and for interacting. And yeah, I'm looking forward to our next conversation of the mind and meeting on the dance floor, getting some movement into on a dance floor soon.
Yeah, that sounds great. Hopefully in person soon.
Hopefully. Thanks so much, Dan.
Take care, Jake. Thanks again.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dan Turello. I know I did. Thank you so much for listening. Definitely check out all the links that we're sharing below. Listen to the episodes that Dan mentioned, and for sure, check out his photography work on the website that I'm sharing. Thanks again, and keep on growing.